This is an excerpt from the book The Jews and Moral Subversion by E. Michael Jones. Introduction. Eyeless in Gaza. Pornography and Psychological Warfare. At 4:30 p.m. on March 30th, 2002, Israeli military forces took over Palestinian TV stations when they occupied Ramallah in the West Bank, immediately shutting them down. What followed was a little more unusual. Shortly after occupying the AI Watan TV station, the Israeli forces began broadcasting pornography over its transmitter. Eventually, according to a report from The Advertiser, an Australian newspaper, the Israelis expanded their cultural offensive against the Palestinian people by broadcasting pornography over two other Palestinian stations, the Amwaj and A Sharak channels. One 52-year-old Palestinian mother of 3 children, according to the report in The Advertiser, complained about the deliberate psychological damage caused by these broadcasts. The only Palestinian station not taken over by the Israelis ran a written message at the bottom of its screen claiming that anything currently shown on AI Watan and other local TV channels has nothing to do with Palestinian programs, but is being broadcast by the Israeli occupation forces. We urge parents to take precautions. Why in the world, one woman wondered, should one do such a thing? This explanation is put forth in The People versus Larry Flynt, a big-budget Hollywood apologia for Hollywood's connection to the porn industry. It got produced as a piece of pro-pornography propaganda when Congress was debating the Communications Decency Act in the early 1990s, which was supposed to ban obscenity from the internet. So according to the official explanation, Israeli troops began broadcasting pornography over captured Palestinian TV stations because they wanted to spread freedom among the Palestinian people. Somehow that doesn't sound right. The simple fact of the matter is that this incident simply cannot be explained according to the principles available in contemporary American culture. In order to understand the disparity between the official explanation of pornography and what might be termed its military use, we have to go back to the ancients. The story of Samson and Delilah is a good place to start, except for the fact that the roles are reversed in that story. Israel was invincible militarily. At least that part hasn't changed. So the Philistines decided that they had to get at the Israelite leader by other than military means. Unable to defeat him in battle, they decided to seduce him sexually. Once Samson succumbed to Delilah's wiles, he lost his power, and Israel lost its leader. They could find him then not on the field of battle, but rather, to use the English poet John Milton's phrase, eyeless in Gaza, grinding at the mill with slaves. Having learned their lesson from Samson, the Israelis decided to turn the tables on their opponents, because they knew that a blind opponent is no opponent at all, and because they knew, as the ancients on the northern side of the Mediterranean, the Greeks, knew as well that lust makes a man blind. St. Thomas Aquinas, giving voice to that same tradition over a millennium later, said that lust darkens the mind. A man without a mind is not a formidable opponent, therefore. Lust can be used as a weapon by rendering an opponent blind or irrational, and therefore incapable of mounting a coherent attack or counterattack. At this point, we are beginning to see the dim outline of why the Israelis were interested in broadcasting pornography. It wasn't because they were interested in promoting freedom. It was because they were interested in promoting freedom's opposite, namely bondage or slavery, because slaves, especially people who are the slaves of their own passions, do not make good fighters. The ancients' explanation of how sexual passion could be put to military use is not all that different than a report issued by the Palestinians at least 3 months before the incident happened. On January 12, 2002, the Islamic Association for Palestine News Agency ran an article claiming that representatives of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and Israeli Shin Bet experts have recommended that the relatively conservative Palestinian society be flooded with pornography, drugs and gambling in order to keep Palestinian youths away from joining the resistance against Israeli occupation and apartheid. The idea, according to the IAP report, first came from the Israeli side, who suggested that only these things could take Palestinian youths away from their hostile fixation on Israel. Apparently, Israel tried broadcasting pornography from at least one television station in the southern part of the West Bank, but had to pull back from its cultural offensive because of protests from Jewish settlers in the area who felt that pornography materials on local screens could have a detrimental effect on the settler population. The settlers, according to one source cited in the IAP article, are mostly religious people, and like most Palestinians, they don't like these things. Augustine, Sin and Servitude, Masters and Vices. 700 years after Samson was blinded by the Philistines at around the time of Alaric's sack of Rome, when the empire tottered on the verge of collapse, and the Christians were being blamed, St. Augustine took the insights of Plato and combined them with those of the Hebrew scriptures to come up with a new formulation of the relationship between slavery and freedom. Unlike Aristotle, who argued that men were slaves physi, which is to say by nature, Augustine took a radically moral view of the issue. Man was free as long as he was moral, which is to say acting according to the dictates of practical reason. It is clear, he wrote in The City of God, that sin is the primary cause of servitude. That means, he continued in another passage from the same book, that a good man, though a slave, is free, but a wicked man, though a king, is a slave, for he serves, not one man alone, but, what is worse, as many masters as he has vices. 2 cities. What followed on the heels of Augustine's admonition looked like the collapse of the civilized world. In reality, the fall of Rome was another term for the birth of Europe out of the wreckage of classical culture. People like Benedict of Nursia saved classical culture by providing through the rule of Saint Benedict a vehicle for Christianization of the ravaging ethnic groups which were then in the process of destroying it. All of history, according to the schema Augustine proposed in The City of God, could now be reduced to 2 options, symbolized by 2 cities. The City of God was based on love of God to the extinction of self, and the City of Man was based on love of self to the extinction of God. If the City of God was based on love of neighbour and service, what is the City of Man based on? It's based on the opposite of love and service, or, to use Augustine's term, and the title of my book on sexual liberation as a form of political control, libido dominandi, the desire to dominate. The distinction I'm trying to make here is like the difference between Jesus Christ and Dracula. Christ shed his blood so that we might have eternal life. Dracula sheds your blood so that he can have eternal life. For 1,000 years following the fall of the Roman Empire, a fall which Augustine witnessed with his own eyes, Christian Europe based its culture increasingly and more effectively on Augustine's principle. That doesn't mean that no sins were committed in that part of the world for that particular millennium, but it does mean that the increasingly unified group of ethnic Christian communities which made up Europe had at least the right idea, the City of God, before them as their model. It also meant that they had the right idea of freedom, namely, that its essence was reasonable, moral behaviour.